But even a game's lousy story can be salvaged by incredible gameplay. Sadly, Other M stopped just short of mediocre. Some fans have spoken quite highly of Other M's gameplay, and while it's not nearly as great an eyesore as the story, it really doesn't do any favors to a framework that's already about to tumble. None of the gameplay mechanics are terrible, per se, they're just not without their faults. In some cases, the bad outweighs the good. There's just nothing here that really redeems the story, or stands on its own. Some fans have hailed Other M's gameplay as risky and unique, a bold departure from the previous Prime games, which seems to undermine what a huge step forward those games were, especially as it seems to ignore the older 2D games that preceded them. When Metroid Prime was about to come out, a large number of people in the gaming community thought it was going to be a terrible game. Retro Studios was a brand new development company and was taking a game series that had never been done in 3D before and presented it in a first-person perspective. But the game didn't play like a shooter and was dubbed a first-person adventure game by Nintendo. They had everything working against them, and what they managed to make was one of the most critically acclaimed games of the last console generation. Now, I would say that is a pretty sizable risk. If all someone was able to get out of the Prime games was that they were just a generic first-person shooter, then I highly question their objectivity, and they might as well label Shadow of the Colossus a hack and slasher, or every Nintendo game a kiddie title. Now hopefully other gamers consider games to be art, and anyone with any semblance of knowledge on the subject knows that art is rarely so black and white as some people are suggesting. Just because something looks like it fits into one category, it doesn't necessarily mean that it does, nor does it mean that it has to adhere to any of that category's guidelines. While Metroid Prime does look like a first-person shooter, it has more in common with a Zelda game, but in a first-person perspective, and with a gun. If one were to view Metroid Prime solely as a first-person shooter, it wouldn't hold up very well, but as Nintendo dubbed it, a first-person adventure, it's an entirely different story altogether. And for the sake of argument, even if Metroid Prime is a first-person shooter, how is that a bad thing? Some of the greatest games ever made have technically been first-person shooters. Just because some shooters have negatively reflected the gaming community, it doesn't paint them all with the same brush. I mean, I loathe the Twilight series, but I'm not going to take it out on Joss Whedon. Other M is different, but I really don't see how it takes a bigger step forward than Prime, especially as many of its accomplishments have already been done before or better. I'll go into greater detail, but ultimately it just feels bland and quickly became repetitive. It is by no means unique, and it doesn't help matters that the level of immersion that the previous Metroid games managed to convey is pretty much gone. It basically runs like a 2D side-scroller, in many ways very much like the original Metroid games, so I really wouldn't call it that big of a step forward, except for the portions where the game opens up. The problem with the gameplay begins with the control setup itself, and initially this brought back flashes of Sonic 3D Blast. Rather than using the nunchuck attachment, Other M uses the basic Wii remote, which would be good for those who don't have the attachment, but for a game that's aimed at the hardcore market, you'd think Nintendo would expect us to already have the nunchuck attachment. After all, Mario Galaxy, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword needed it, and they didn't really have any trouble in the sales department. Controlling Samus with the D-pad does work better than one might think, but it's still not recommended for long playthroughs, and it doesn't provide nearly as much precision as an analog stick would. The problem is that the basic Wii remote just doesn't have enough buttons for all of Samus's actions, which leads to some interesting combinations. Missiles can only be fired in the first-person view, more on that later, and aiming is largely done through auto-aim. The auto-aim generally works more often than not, but the ratio isn't as favorable as one might think. If the nunchuck analog stick was used, the Wiimote could have been used for manual aiming, which could have been far more accurate. The use of the first-person perspective and the ability to switch back and forth from first to third has been done by games in the past, but not necessarily in this way, and for good reason. Because of the control setup, you have to rotate the controller 90 degrees to point at the screen in order to enter this perspective. Aside from the obvious problem of the delay it takes for the game itself to make the transition, regardless of how fast you are, and the damage enemies will do to you in the meantime, the control of the first-person perspective is terrible. First off, you can't move, and any targeting that you attempt to do is incredibly cumbersome, almost tank-like in its efficiency. It wouldn't be so bad if Metroid Prime 3 hadn't already used the Wii remote in a first-person manner and had been far superior, but as you can tell, that seems to be somewhat of a theme between the Prime games and Other M. Aside from the fact that you have to use this mode to combat certain enemies, it's further confounded by points in the game where it forces you into this mode and refuses to let the game progress until you do what it wants. Sometimes this is used in boss encounters. More frequently, this is used to search the environment for key items. These pixel hunt scenes, as they've come to be known, are troublesome for a few reasons. First off, it's not always clear what exactly you're looking for, and even if you do know, make sure you're playing with a good television because otherwise, you'll never find it. The biggest problem I have is that there seems to be no point to these segments. In every case, the game comes to a halt just so that Samus can scan for this tiny little object, and then the game just starts back up again. Usually this happens in the midst of a cutscene, so my question is, why do we need to stop the cutscene? It's not like you can change the outcome of the cutscene based on what you do, so why not just keep the cutscene going? What does this add? It doesn't make the game more immersive. These segments are so annoying they just jar you right out of the experience. So what does it add? Well, if you've been keeping track, nothing. It was just added as a throwback to Metroid Prime and to try and up the immersion factor. Ironically, it just makes the game far more frustrating and weaker for it. It's just trying to reuse the scan mechanic from Metroid Prime, but whereas that was an integral part of the game that you used from the beginning to the end, this only comes up when the game thinks it should. Again, that's not good game design. Giving a player an ability, but only letting them use it when the game wants you to, is generally frowned upon by the gaming community. One thing I was very interested in was the game's implementation of combat. Samus is rarely shown using close quarters combat, and this was genuinely the first game to do so, not counting Smash Bros. Sadly, the button limitation rears its ugly head yet again. You'll spend most of the fights running around tougher enemies, just waiting to use the finishing move attack once you've done enough damage. It generally works, but it gets old really quickly. You can use a dodge move to help evade enemy attacks, which works most of the time, but it can be pretty unreliable in its own right, and several times will send you flying into a boss's attack rather than away from it. Compared to combat in a game such as, say, Arkham Asylum, the options in Other M seem very limited. Being able to initiate physical attacks without waiting for a QuickTime key, or greater control over Samus's abilities, such as being able to use the grapple beam offensively, would have gone on a long way to making combat seem much more fluid. You know, little things like making Samus's dodge actually reflect what the attack is, rather than just giving her the same generic dodge over and over again. That would go a long way to combating the repetitive nature of the combat, and also would help avoid you jumping into enemy attacks. If you want to see how this should be done right, go play Arkham Asylum, or Arkham City, you'll see what I mean. Not that the game is hard by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, in many cases, it's almost a little too easy. There is a hard mode for those who want an extra challenge, though it accomplishes this somewhat cheaply. Essentially, it just removes any health or missile upgrades, which you could already have done in any other Metroid game, in addition to their actual hard modes. Even with Metroid Prime, you felt like you were right up in the action. Other M just feels disconnected in this regard. It feels far more artificial, and once you figure out how to play the system, encounters seem to lose their intensity. Another new addition to this game is the manner in which Samus replenishes her health and ammo. In past games, the player could only do so through recharge stations, or by collecting dropped ammo or health orbs from enemies. In Other M, the latter is entirely removed. While Samus does recharge within save stations, she can only recharge her health and ammo on the field when her health reaches a dangerously critical level, at which point the player can have Samus concentrate, as it's called, to give a small boost to her health and ammo, which makes about as much sense as regaining health from orbs, but this does effectively ruin any tension to be found in the game, as it basically gives you unlimited ammo and an endless supply of health. Enemies appear to give a set amount of damage, especially in boss fights. Once you figure out what that amount is, you can determine a safe zone, a point in which you can take enough damage to use the concentration ability, but not enough to actually kill you. This unfortunately kills any sense of immersion the game may have held, as the player is boiling each encounter down to a numbers game. In previous Metroid games, the player may often find themselves far from a save point, with a limited amount of ammo and dwindling health. This sense of isolation and suspense made the subsequent encounters far more engaging, but in Other M, there's none of this tension. Quite often, I would intentionally take damage, especially on the hard mode, just so that I would be able to use the concentration ability to restore my ammo. Another addition that I thought had potential was when the game would switch to an over-the-shoulder perspective, which, although it wasn't the first game to use this perspective, was somewhat popularized by Resident Evil 4. Switching to this perspective could help with the immersion issue, as the player would feel closer to the action, their field of view would be limited, and it might help create a greater suspense. However, the switches to this perspective only occur at set moments, and in almost every case, you know that a cutscene is sure to follow. It makes these segments just feel like padding, as Samus is unable to use any of her abilities and has to walk very slowly. Again, this is just another example of wasted potential. There's a lot that could have been done with a perspective like this, but it's just used as padding. The methodology of progression in a Metroid game has become an almost dogmatic attribute of the franchise. For those unfamiliar with it, in each game, Samus starts out with the most basic of her equipment, and through exploration, puzzle solving, and epic battles, is able to uncover enhancements or completely new abilities. This allows her to access new areas and locations she had already visited, which she had been unable to reach with her more limited locomotion. It's become almost a point of ridicule for the series, as Samus seems to lose her armory before every mission. Other M deviates from that in this game, as Samus already has all her abilities, but refuses to use them until her commanding officer authorizes their usage, which, when you think about it, has a lot of potential. The player could have the ability to activate and deactivate said abilities, but doing so without authorization would affect the relationship with the other squad members, which could help add to the tension. Sadly, this is really just used as a gameplay device rather than to help the actual plot. You have no control to reactivate your abilities, and the game does it only when Adam says so, which is usually when the game has decided it's wasted enough time to warrant activating them. And make no mistake, that's exactly what this is. It's a game lengthening ploy. In one instance, a broken bridge leaves you unable to get to the exit you were trying to reach, but without authorization to use the speed boost, or screw attack, or any number of your abilities, Samus has to take an alternative path. The problem is, this path leads you away from your destination and adds about 20 minutes to your journey. Finally, you come to a wall which you can't get through, and finally Adam authorizes you to use your speed boost to break through the wall. After getting through the wall and continuing down your path, you find yourself back in front of the bridge you wanted to clear in the first place. You literally went around in circles. In previous games, there was always a sense of growth and accomplishment when you acquired a new ability, but in Other M, with one exception, not only are all the abilities old ones, you're just given them. And of course, there's the infamous Hell Run, where Samus is required to navigate an area of the map in which the environment is so hot she's constantly taking damage. Activating one of her suit's abilities would protect her, but she doesn't because Adam doesn't tell her that she can. Why is this again?
As far as your other weapons go, we will continue to investigate and authorize use as we can. However, we currently have no plans to authorize the use of power bombs. As you know, they have the ability to spread a high-temperature heat wave over a large area, impacting living things, which is a nice way of saying they can vaporize humans instantly. You should be well aware of how dangerous power bombs are, and how their devastation can't be obstructed with common materials.
That doesn't even begin to make sense. If the power bombs are a big threat, then just say, don't use the power bombs. Plus, we use power bombs later in the game, and they have no impact in the environment whatsoever. Clearly they're not that big a problem. And if her weapons are so bad, then just don't use any of the major upgrades. But no, he takes away everything. How is a basic heat shield a threat to the safety of the operation? Clearly his men have heat shields, as they can enter areas like this, so why can't Samus? But no, Samus has to run around this area, constantly taking damage, and only when she encounters the boss, assuming you even get to the boss. It's very possible that the damage you're taking will cause you to die. Samus is actually willing to let her own life slip away, slowly burning to death because Daddy didn't tell her so.
We can disobey suicidal orders. Why wasn't I told?
That's about twice a day.
Anyway, it's ridiculous. I can't remember who made this analogy, but someone on the comment section of Joystick or Kotaku said it best. It was in response to defenders of the game saying that this excuse makes much more sense than Samus just losing them by accident or malfunction. The analogy went a little like this. You have two scenarios. You're jumping out of a crashing plane, you can't use your parachute and are about to die, either because the parachute is broken or because you weren't told to pull the cord. To anyone who actually thinks the latter sounds like a decent excuse, could you please do us a favor and lead by example? The upgrade mechanic, while I like the idea of this new direction and what they could have done with it, is merely a superficial alteration to finding upgrades. It doesn't change gameplay or the story in any meaningful way. In fact, it just creates more problems. And as if to provide the final fuck you to the player, in one of the final encounters in the game, you're required to use an ability, a power bomb specifically, but the game doesn't give any indication that you've actually acquired that ability. In this specific scenario, you're swallowed by this final boss monster and have about 5 seconds before you're killed. It takes about 3 seconds to charge the bomb, and you clearly need that last second to fire it, so there really isn't much margin for error. Now, in the past, every upgrade has been clearly announced to the player, with instructions for its usage, but the power bomb gets no such thing. By this point in the game, it was only used once during the initial tutorial, and the player has no idea that they've even activated the ability. Now, when I was playing, it seemed pretty obvious that the power bomb was what you needed to use to counter this specific situation. However, I have been given no indication that I even had the power bombs. Unless you actually check your inventory screen when you're being swallowed, there's no way to know. So you'll die like 1 to 3 times before you even figure it out, and then likely another time just trying to get the timing right. That's not good game design, people. It's Pavlov's conditioning reflex. The player is conditioned to trust that the game will inform them when they acquire an upgrade. So when they get an upgrade but there's no warning, they're not going to notice it. And it's not just me, that's science, bitches. It's the developers tricking us. Who in their right mind would find tricking the player to be endearing and not counting the cool Eternal Darkness sanity tricks? Why would you set up the expectation that every upgrade would be announced and then not announce one when you really need it? How hard would it have been to have accessed the ability sooner, or to at least announce it? The game is not without its own faults, including an interesting game-breaking glitch in which a door won't open, resulting in you having to start your entire game from scratch. Of course, a glitch like this could have easily been fixed through a downloadable patch, but as far as Nintendo is concerned, no one plays games online, so what's the point in having such a service? Instead, you either need to start your game all over again, or mail your disc in to be replaced. Anyone else see the symbolism of Nintendo sticking to a service like mail, rather than relying on its digital counterpart? Again, the gameplay isn't bad, it's just not very good. This is an aspect where Other M could have redeemed itself, and made up for the story, but that isn't the case. It would have needed to be much better to pull that off. This really just feels like wasted potential. I know the gameplay segment is a little more subjective than, say, the story, but a third-person Metroid game with an in-depth combat system would have been incredible, but Other M just feels cobbled together. Even if you like the idea of what this game is going for, the gameplay itself is far too rough to be considered a finished product. Maybe if they had more time, it could have been passable, but honestly, it just feels half-assed, and it's unsettling to see that players want more just like this.